Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first 301 exclusive interview with today a very special guest. My name is Sebo Abrahamian. I usually host the Meet the Revolution podcast, but today I'm your host at the 301 exclusive. And with me today is Anna Astvatsaturian Turcotte, and she's a very important person to the cause. Is a very important, I want to say, soldier in the battle against the injustice of the Armenian people. Um, Anna, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Nice to see you.
Same here, same here. We've met each other before in Holland when you came and had a very inspiring book presentation. How's everything in general? Hope you're doing well, of course. Your health, family. Tell me a little bit
Yeah,
about yourself.
yeah. Thank you very much. Kids are much taller than the last time you and I met, and I believe we met with your father, your sister, and your whole family. So it's been a long time, but they're well, and thank you very much for asking.
Great, great. Um, as you know, we're slowly approaching the 27th of February, which is the Remembrance Day for the Sumgai pogroms and the Baku and Kirov pogroms as well, of course. Um, you're you're very well versed in the material. You know a lot. You're a first-hand witness. Uh, so, what does this day mean to you? What does this day actually? How do you approach 27th of February, if we can?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a before and after, right? Sumgait to me was a the end of my childhood. Um, I turned 10 soon after some guide events, so I was 9 years old. And when Sumgait massacres occurred in the city of Sumgait, which is about 30 miles, I'm sorry, 30 minute drive from the center of Baku. It was considered a suburb of Baku, but a separate city. And when these massacres occurred, things definitely changed for us as an Armenian minority of Azerbaijan in Baku, in Kiribati, and in other cities. Not drastically, not right away, but you could sense that things have changed. And it was a difficult time because we didn't really know what was true. We heard things from relatives, we heard things that were rumors, and nothing was ever reported. But now, looking back at it, we know that these events were definitely the beginning um, of the mass aggression against the Armenian community of Azerbaijan, and it was a response to the Karabakh movement to for independence and to rejoin Armenia.
So it gradually became what it eventually was. Did you in any way sensed? I know you were a child back then, but did you feel anything of the animosity? Was there any change in the interaction with and relations with your neighbors, let's say, or friends? Maybe. I mean, I assume that you have had some other friends at the time.
Yeah, and I describe it, in my diaries that I kept as a refugee, which ended up being the book that you mentioned. And I think that if I didn't write them down, those details would have kind of been lost in the background of everything that happened after. So it was a good idea to write it down, and I um, absolutely the friends that we had in school, not just Azeri friends, but also Russian friends, had changed in the demeanor. They were, you know, uh, fourth, fifth graders, 9, 10 year olds, but they heard things and understood things from their parents, so they communicated those same feelings that their parents communicated or heard from relatives in school. Playing outside with friends was different. And then, of course, how we behaved, how we walked down the street. I was told by my dad to always have my face down because I look very Armenian. And so when you walk down the street, lower your head. And if you are asked if you're Armenian, you have to say you're Greek, or or something else, and just not Armenian. So it was absolutely, and it's interesting to me that you mentioned that I was a child, and my parents thought the same thing, that if they just say a bare minimum to us, then we would be protected. But there was no way to hide from that change, because it was in everything, and it's in how you talked, how I knew a little bit about Karabakh from my grandmother, but they didn't want to talk to us about it because they were afraid that we would say something in school, and that could end up hurting us physically, and hurting the family. So absolutely. And my parents, when they first read my book after it came out, they were very surprised at how much I understood and how much I knew, um, even though they were trying to guard us against it.
I can't imagine how it would be for a child to express, to be able to express these feelings. I mean, they are very complex feelings, but eventually you did manage, and I'm very happy that you eventually wrote the book. I've heard you tell about it. I've heard you talk about the experiences, mind blowing at times, staggering, horrible, frightening. Uh, but in one way, how do you feel? Does it feel liberating to be able to, talk about these things? Is it on an emotional level? Does this give closure? You said it was the end of my childhood. I mean, to
Right.
me, that's a strong statement. It's a
Yeah.
powerful statement. So, how do
Well,
you?
the reason that I started writing in the diaries was because my grandmother was a teacher of Russian literature, and so she felt that if I was to write it down, then all my questions and all my anxiety that I had about what was going on around us would help me process it and deal with it. And perhaps it did at the time, but um, when we came to United States, I translated the diary into what is now a book. I was 14 years old, and as I was practicing my English, translating the diary for my future children, that was the plan. That processing it was almost like saying goodbye to the homeland. We left Armenia at that point, and saying goodbye to what happened, and preserving the history from my future descendants. And I thought that was it, right? But for the next 2 decades, as I was uh, putting myself on my feet, putting myself through university, and then financing myself through law school, building a family, all those things were in the back of my mind, and I never wanted to address it, right? Never went to Armenia once in 22 years. After that, didn't want to remember, didn't want to read anything about the news, completely cut off, thinking that would protect me emotionally. And in fact, what ended up happening is I knew that there was something that I was just so unhappy about, that I didn't have closure. I didn't, in Armenian, most of our Armenian families, getting therapy for things like that was not something that we did. And so it cultivated into health problems, and many Baku Armenians deal with health problems. Many have early, cancers, early deaths, heart attacks, and things like that. So when I had my children, that's when I realized that I needed to publish it. And things in Artsakh was still going on, and I think having the kids kind of put it in perspective. Now, as a mother, there are mothers like me that are trying to protect their kids on the border with Azerbaijan, and the conflict's still ongoing. So I would say publishing it and letting it out was much more therapeutic, and talking about it, having Baku Armenians come to my events and say, I couldn't tell my kids what happened to us, but I gave them my book, or, I gave them your book so that they could know our story. And that was so, to help my community that way, to preserve what to educate is one thing, but also to get the word out so that they feel that they're not forgotten, that they are supported and remembered in such a loving way. Um, and coming to my events, that was absolutely the most therapeutic thing I could have done for myself to move on and feel empowered, because that was more of, I'm speaking about it. I'm not a victim. I'm a fighter. I'm a survivor. I'm a fighter, and I'm standing up for the people of Artsakh in such a way, and not be afraid
Definitely.
anymore.
No, definitely. You've actually become one of the most important voices for the I don't know, in seeking justice for Artsakh. But that journey did start uh, from Baku, and I want to zoom in a little bit on how that went. So you fled from Baku. Did you went to Armenia, I believe, and then from Armenia you went immediately to the United States. Could you please zoom in
Yeah,
on that a bit?
absolutely. So we waited until very end of September. My parents, my mom didn't want to leave. She couldn't believe that something like that would happen to us in Baku, because it was a very intellectual, multicultural city. Sumgait wasn't, and so we could say, okay, Sumgait happened. We can kind of rationalize it. It was Kirovabad happened. It would never happen in Baku. And then she did get scared. There was an incident, and she just one day got us tickets, and we left at the end of September of 1989. We didn't have anywhere really to go. In the Soviet Union, you couldn't just pick up and move. You had to get documentation, approvals, work permits, and all those things so that you could work in Armenia or in Russia. So it was nearly impossible. And so we just left, and my dad couldn't get his work documents to be able to continue working, because his boss just kept it. It was a way of terrorizing, right? And my aunt, it was similarly, my aunt was kept in Baku until February of 1990, way past the massacres, so she was in hiding. So they would terrorize in that way too. And finally my dad could get the tickets, or the documentation, so that he could leave, and he left in October of 1989. We came to Armenia. We lived with the relatives. In fact, my grandmother's sister, who uh, we lived with her in a 2-room apartment, 11 of us, for months. She just passed away yesterday, and she was 96 years old and a heart of gold. So she
God
could,
rest her soul.
thank you, a wonderful woman, and relatives did help us, but many were afraid, right? Like, what does that mean? How long are you going to live with us? So we lived with, we ended up living in a dungeon-like basement of a relative's home. My dad tried to make it livable, but it was pretty subhuman, and there was blockade, and there was nowhere really for us to go. And at some point in that year, in 1991, a decision was made to apply for refugee status with the United States. Um, and the application was put in Moscow. At the time, there were no embassies in Yerevan because it was Soviet Union. So my mom would fly back and forth or take the train, and it was a lengthy process with a lot of documentation, a lot of translation. But we ended up getting it, and we ended up getting the permission to leave, to enter the United States, but not to leave the Soviet Union. And we were up for review around the coup in 1991 when the Soviet Union had that coup with Gorbachev. So we were delayed, and we had to go to Moscow and bribe officials with our last money that we had to let us out, because that was insane. And they did, and it was January 30th, actually, 30th anniversary of us arriving to United States was just this past January 31st. So 30 years ago.
30 years now. That's been
Now
a
you can now you can guess how old I am. 43.
um, well, but it's a massive journey and a very important one. But how did that resonate throughout the whatever happened in Baku, whatever happened in Sumgait? I'm sure your community, you're well known in the community. The Baku Armenians know each other rather well, and because I've heard stories, right? How did that, what happened in Sumgait, Baku, and Kirova, how did that resonate throughout the rest of Armenia? As you know, we were going through the earthquake, and I've heard about the stories about how they would send empty carts with messages written on them. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
So, if I understood correctly, you were trying to understand how Armenia reacted to the pogroms, right?
Yeah.
While they were happening. So, when Sumgait happened, it was very odd. The first time in 80-year history of Soviet Union, that's the first we heard of it. The Soviet Union would never allow that. There's no pogroms in Soviet Union. We're all friends. And then when there was a movement for not just to get rid of Armenians, but also secede from Soviet Union, that's when the tanks came in. And the tanks came in around the time of Kirovabad massacres in November of 1988. We had tanks on our street during that time when the earthquake happened in December of 88. And the reaction of us Azeris to the earthquakes was sending us congratulatory cards and yay, congratulations, Armenians are dead. So there was a lot of that. We would be calling, after Kirovabad happened, my parents, especially my aunt, would call Armenian relatives and say, what is going on there? What are you doing that they're killing us here? None of that, was on the news. I mean, we knew Kirovabad happened in response to Artsakh liberation movement, but we didn't understand what was happening. And they said, well, we're out in the streets, we're demonstrating to rejoin Artsakh and Armenia. And we would say, are you crazy? They were going to kill us here. And I would, I remember my relatives would, some of them respond with, you're not patriotic enough, and we are in a preservation mode. So when we actually arrived to Armenia, there was already refugees from Spitak earthquake, and we were just a nuisance in many ways, because there was a flood of 350,000, and then you have the flood from the north from the earthquake. There was no plan how to help us, and we, on the other hand, were traumatized and missing our home, right? So in many ways, we're treated as, how can you miss the home? And the home is the enemy. But we build that home, right? When people say, well, you don't say you build Baku, Armenians didn't build Baku. I'm not saying Baku was Armenian. What I'm saying is, so many of us contributed to its streets, to its fountains, to its bridges, to its infrastructure, the oil economy. So we were definitely not understood in Armenia when we came, and we spoke Russian, which was even worse.
Uh, do you, is there any resentment? was there any resentment at the time? I believe so, right? I mean, it's kind of hard to feel at home when everything's tumultuous, there's chaos. How did you go through that emotionally?
Well, I definitely described that in a book, and I was very hesitant to when I was publishing it, that I didn't want to offend Armenians in any way, by how I was describing the situation in my book. But I felt like if I was to take that out, then I would take a piece of our history out. So the first few months, it was like, we're safe, we're not being hunted and killed, and we are at home, and physically we're safe. But then the emotionally, it started, right, attending school and I didn't speak Armenian, or getting bread and speaking Russian, um standing in line for bread, and like, what, go back to where you came from kind of attitude. Absolutely, there was resentment, and then you add that I was a child and justice was so important to me. How dare say that to me? How dare you say I'm not Armenian enough? I am. I almost died for being Armenian, and here I come, and I'm not considered Armenian by my own people. So, and was not just obviously because I was a child. It was a compounded trauma, trauma of surviving something like that, and then trauma of being not being belonging anywhere, and then trauma of not being wanted. So many Baku Armenians left not because it was hard to live there during the blockade. That obviously was a part of it, but we couldn't see our future in Armenia if we were, you know, called Turks. And I was called a Baku whore at 11 years old. So it was not now that as an adult, and obviously understanding history a little more, that experience does not shape in my understanding what Armenia is. My experience is not what Armenia is. It's a piece of it, so I can remove myself from that resentment. And the first 22 years, absolutely, we would rather send money to our relatives than spend it on a plane to go there. Why would I want to go there and relive those feelings? Um, and then in 2014, that changed. I went to Armenia for the first time.
I can imagine that being an entirely different experience.
It was. I went with my dad, and I received a medal for my Artsakh work, and I had to go. Like, I can't not go. And I have to go to Artsakh. If I am advocating for Artsakh, how can I go? So I went with my dad the first time, and I would say the first few days was kind of numb feeling. And then, and I describe it in one of the articles I wrote in the Armenian Weekly after I came back, how um, I was at the Republic Square and I saw all those kids with balloons and the fountain, and just the feeling of life. And I just broke down in tears. And my dad, he knew that, he knew that it was coming, because um, I remember that fountain being empty and there's no electricity and no one was smiling, and people were hungry and cold. And here it's like, you can't kill us. There's no way to destroy us. If after that we have a Republic Square that's alive, and kids
Vibrant.
are around and lively. That was incredibly emotional for me. And and that's when I was like, and now I go 2-3 times a year. you can't you can't not go.
Yeah, I mean, Armenia has been growing ever since. We as a people, as a nation, our institutions. It's everything's a slow and gradual process. Um,
Absolutely.
just like the political processes, where you now are a strong advocate for Artsakh. Uh, I mean, the struggle for the recognition of Artsakh has been on your agenda, and right now we're more or less in a new phase, right? And the struggle for recognition is still ongoing. You've been a voice in this matter. Uh, I don't want to kick it right in the to the political professional sphere, but first of all, let's start from the beginning. How did you start that entire struggle for yourself? As in, when did that become a factor in your life?
Well, I was a very private person. Obviously, international law was always, I love Netherlands because I spent my first year after law school in The Hague. I worked at the International Criminal Court, and international justice, criminal law, international, crimes was always on my agenda. Just in the periphery was Armenia and what happened to me. And so I avoided all things Armenia for a while. And then, like I said, when I had my kids, I said, I have this book. I need to publish it. And I was told by Tatulson and Papaziana, you might know who he is.
Yes,
He
definitely.
edited the book, and he edited it for me, and he said this was the first and only account of an events unfolding and you writing about it as they're unfolding. So it's a historic book. So he assisted me, and was very much a grandfather figure for me in many ways. And so when it came out in 2012, um, I thought, okay, I did my job. It's out there in the library somewhere. Maybe someday someone will read it. And then I was invited to speak on Capitol Hill literally within a few months of it coming out. And if you look for it on YouTube, ANCA has it. It was December 2012, and it's about 5 minutes, and it's my first ever publicly speaking about what happened to my family. And I would say that while I was there, it was kind of like an eye-opening moment for me, that you could see the politicians speaking about Karabakh. You could see diplomats speaking about it. And then the room was completely different when I spoke about it. And the power of that voice, that firsthand account, the emotion behind it, and the realness that I'm not that old, and it happened in my lifetime, and it happened in my family's lifetime, in three generations. Right, my grandfather survived 1915. He survived a massacre in Baku 1918, and then we survived Baku. So it was a stunning moment. That's when I was like, this is what I need to do. It's not, I have nightmares every time I talk about it. It's not good for my health, my family. I get death threats, and but that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years, speaking on Capitol Hill, speaking at the European Parliament, traveling, really speaking to Armenian communities, because 10 years ago, it's been 10 years, 2012. There are pockets of the community that never heard of Sumgait, or knew that there was massacres in Azerbaijan, or knew that Artsakh was not independent. And so it was important for me to not only educate the non-Armenians, but also our communities in the diaspora, and be the voice for Artsakhtsis, because to me I was the forgotten Armenian, and they were becoming the forgotten Armenians. And so that was, and then the next step was my husband and I had the state of Maine recognize Artsakh. That was a third state to recognize it. And so I assisted in several states' recognitions, also quashing some of the Azeri resolutions, Hojalu resolutions, that they, in every community you go, you'll find a Baku Armenian that can help put those things to rest. So I've been able to help in that sense. And then at the end of that, as my fan base on Facebook especially grew, I have a huge following there. The humanitarian efforts started. So I didn't want to be that person that collected money and did things. Like, I really saw myself as more of a political voice, but I couldn't turn away from the opportunity to help Artsakhtsis and Sunniktsis. My family comes from Sunnik and Nakhchivan. So so I've been doing a lot of the humanitarian projects as well, but also tying it to the past, planting a forest in Armenia, but on 30th anniversary of Baku Pogroms. So always connecting it somehow in order to educate.
Yeah, and you kind of mentioned it already. You started a foundation, and
Yep.
you've been working on a number of interesting and very important things, uh, like a census as well, right? That was very interesting to me and very important. So I would like to ask you about that. How
Yeah.
and why did you actually start this project?
Well, the first instance that this idea, well, the idea of the foundation happened because I wanted transparency for the funds that people were sending me. Yes, I can show you a picture of what we did, but legally, I wanted to make sure that the funds were, yeah, the people in the United States can get a tax deduction every time they donated. They were huge amounts. And at one point, my accountant said, you had $100,000 in donations. You need a foundation. You need a charity. So that was kind of the plan before the war. And the first thing I wanted to do was work with the kids. My father's a very well Armenian renowned artist, and so I wanted to do art projects for the kids and art scholarship. That was an idea. And then when the Tavush happened, okay, that put it on hold. We built two bomb shelters in Tavush right after the event, and then the war started. And so the first project after during the war that came to my mind, the first project really of the foundation was the census, or at least a collection of loss assessment. What happened, who it happened to, what they lose, because no one ever cared about Baku Armenians. How many apartments did you leave in the center of Baku? Probably 50,000.
Really?
How much is an apartment in the middle of Baku worth now? Who knows how many we have, but we know what it's worth. So it's just calculated like from legal perspective. That's huge loss economically. And then you add the psychological impact, medical impact. My community, so many of us, so many of my uncles passed away in their 40s and 50s because of the impact of the mass atrocities and the life that led after. So during the war, it was important to me to ask the government of Armenia and Artsakh, and I'm very good friends with Artak Beglarian and Mr. Arman Tatoyan. And so I wrote to them and said, are you collecting the refugee information? Do you know how many people left? And Artak said to me that, well, the war is still ongoing. So these communities might go back. And then I asked again, and nothing, after the end of the war, they were trying to put themselves together in our Artsakh. And Arman Tatoyan had, so many other things that he was worried about the Armenian border. So I said, is anyone in the government of Artsakh or Armenia doing this? And they said no. I said, will this be helpful to you? And they said yes. So I put together a team very quickly. In November is when we started working. By January, we had a project plan, and I started fundraising for it quietly because I didn't want to blast it all over the social media to Azeris, who were at that time about 600,000 hits a day on my social media from Azerbaijan and Turkey. So quietly we fundraised for this, and we were able to raise about 85,000 to hire 300 social workers, train them, and get them to do these interviews. We got questions from a Ministry of Social Affairs, from Araman Tatoyan's Human Rights Ombudsman Office, both of Artsakh and Armenia, and Ministry of Justice also, collaborated to make sure this questionnaire, the data that we would receive would be helpful to all of them, not just, one. And we did. We went, obviously we couldn't question them all because many people left, but it was about 350 questionnaire, and it has data on over, about 25,000 families we were able to locate. Some of them didn't open doors to us. They didn't want to be asked. But majority of them did, and we have that information that's now helping Artsakh rebuild itself. How many teachers do you have? How many kids do you have? How many homeless do you have?
Wow.
How many have psychological impact, or how many were military or veterans? How many were wounded but are not military? So it's so helpful to understand impact. But at the same time, we also collected documentation of their property, photos, documents of property they left behind in Hadrut and Shushi, and I have over 11,000 photos of that. So we did this very quietly. We wanted to make sure that it was done in a very standard way, that it would be admissible in a court of law if needed. And also that it was done by social services standards. So a social worker has to have a rapport with their interviewee, and so it has to be done in person, so that they trust you with that information. What's a needs assessment if you can't trust it? So we wanted to make sure that the data was clean, that it was honest, that the person exists. We didn't do it by phone. There were only few villages we did this by phone, and those were villages that the interviewers themselves felt unsafe traveling to in Artsakh. So it's huge. And if I die tomorrow, I'm most proud of it, because it's also going to be helpful for future generations to know what
Definitely.
impact. We don't know what happened in Baku. We don't know
Stay
what
healthy.
happened.
Don't.
Yeah.
No, we need you. That's amazing. Very helpful, very important. And I hope that this will not only help people in Artsakh rebuild their homes, but have uh, realize our eventual goal of recognition of the rights of the people of Artsakh. Because we have a long way
Absolutely.
to go, right? Still, let's yeah, let's look at that a bit. What is there still to do? What's on our plate? What are the next steps, either for you or if you want to take it to the next
Yeah.
level,
Well,
geopolitically, judicial. Go ahead.
I know that right now this information is not interesting to the government of Armenia. Artsakh is just trying to stay afloat. So Armenia is not interested in this information. They are aware that it exists. Um, and it's perhaps inconvenient that it exists. And I'm not holding my breath for the government of Armenia to do anything with it. File a court claim or some sort of report that crime against humanity happened. I certainly would love to do that, but it costs money, a lot of money, to be able to have a final report done on the legality of what happened. And perhaps there are people out there that can help me. I'm more than happy to talk to them. But the report, the final summary of what happened from a humanitarian perspective is done. So, the legal report can be based on that. And but I am not impatient. I was impatient to get it collected because I know how refugees live, right? We move, we disappear. It was so difficult for me to find my childhood friends because people just move country to country. And so that's why I started this project right away after the war, even before I could fundraise for it, because I knew that we needed to collect that information now because it would be lost. So now that I have it, I am the most patient person in the world. I will wait to get some sort of finality on what happened to our Tsotsis. Um, as a lawyer, obviously I'm an attorney, but my specialty is regulatory banking compliance, right, and risk management. So yes, I worked at the International Criminal Court, but we also want to make sure that whoever takes that on is not Armenian. So it is completely removed, a person that can have an unbiased conclusion as to what happened, based on all that evidence that we collected. And then if there are, so that's the public international law, proving that a crime against humanity was committed by fear and intimidation and massacres and removing people from their homes and their land. But then there is the private law that, if there is civil law, that if there are groups that want to represent people of Shushi to sue Azerbaijan, you have all that data. I have it. So and that also costs money. And it obviously has to come from those groups that are represented. So if Hadrutsis want access to that data, absolutely, that's what it's there for. But then the third use of it, the humanitarian, the legal, and the third use is I do want this data to live in a in a in a university setting, that it's studied. Right now, I'm very worried about releasing it to just anyone because it's granular information on families and where they live, and it's a security concern to release it. But I think eventually that could be studied and in a scholarly way.
Amazing. There's so much I want to ask you about because although our time is a little is limited, I do want to know because myself I'm pretty invested and um, I always try to know what to do next, especially in terms of Artsakh recognition, how our geopolitical current status, what it allows us to do. For instance, I live in Holland. We protest Azeri embassies. We try to understand the situation, the new status quo. On a geopolitical level, what do you think that we as a people, with your experience, either in law or humanitarian work, where can we go and what can we do?
I think the lesson that I learned from this war, and also from our global historical experience, is that not to wait for someone else to do it. Do it yourself. That's how I operate in my day-to-day personal life. If I see something that needs to be fixed, fix it yourself, and not wait for someone else to do it because they might think it's the right thing to do. We can't afford that anymore. We learned that we are not as politically and diplomatically savvy as we thought we were, as they thought we were, so I thought that I think that we need to, I said it right after the war, and I'll say it again. We need to take notes from Azeris of how they do things. we need to also understand what and by that I mean diplomatically. Obviously, we don't want to commit to war crimes and crimes against humanity, but how they operate in the West, how they operate internally in the country in terms of building up their infrastructure, having a cohesive and clear national objective. That is really kind of the core of our problem is we don't have one.
Yeah, we dropped the
Everyone
ball there.
thinks right, right, my dad says it's the nature of our history. We're as fractured. We're moved. Everyone has its own opinion. We're very independent. We're not like Azerbaijan. There's a story I always say when we lived in Baku and we heard the demonstrations against Armenians. You could hear one cohesive person say something, and then a million people, cheer. And then we came to Armenia, and there were demonstrations for Artsakh, and one person goes on the stage and says blah blah blah, and the other person says, "Get down! You don't know what you're talking about." Then he comes up, and the third person comes up. That's who we are, but we need to open our eyes and say, okay, perhaps that's our nature, and there's a lot of good that comes from individuality, but we can lose Armenia if we are just thinking about ourselves and how to get credit for whatever, power, credit. I mean, you see that in the diaspora too. It's not just Armenia. um, People don't work together because they're not getting the credit for whatever project they're working on, and remove yourself from the equation. Think of the bigger picture, and I think that's what I learned. I don't know. I mean, what do I know?
No,
um,
a lot. Then that's a very good piece of advice. I've always hammered on. I don't want to say ideological conformity because it's always good to have different opinions on many things, but it's very important to understand what you're worth as an individual and what synergy you can create as a collective. Because right now, being individualism has brought us where we are right now. Um,
right. Well, I'll
uh,
give you an example. A few years ago, I was invited, a few years before the war, I was invited to the embassy in Washington. And at the time, the new ambassador was trying to bring Armenians, the representatives of the diaspora organizations, together for a 25th anniversary of Armenia in September. And so they wanted to do a huge event in Washington, D.C., and 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 showcase Armenia in the best way to diplomats, to politicians, and have a kind of a festival that never materialized because those representatives of those organizations couldn't agree on how to do it. And that is such a small but kind of representative example of how we operate in every way. And that's, I think, is it from the diasporan perspective. We want to have control and impact on Armenia and what it does day to day, but we can't even do that here. Imagine if we have a say in Armenia. So it's a global problem. I don't think that we learned our lessons, unfortunately. I think it's a business as usual, and I think that I go to Armenia. I just came back in October, and um, I think it's a little better. I think the first time it was definitely a shell shock from the war. It's a little better now, but it's business as usual. You know, it's as if our taxis don't exist, and that to me is the most shocking thing.
I know exactly what you mean. I'm visiting Armenia like 3 times a year as well. It's a terrifying picture because I don't know if this is what it's supposed to be. Um, But we have to get better. We have to survive. We have to improve. We have to grow. And thankfully, we have examples like you and people like you and activists. And you mentioned a couple of organizations. We really have to find that piece of, I guess, self-sacrifice. Find out that motivation to understand what we're doing it for. Because like this and the way we have operated for so long is what resulted in losing Artsakh. But thank you for being that example, Anajan. It's been a pleasure to have you. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for you know for giving a piece of your very valuable time.
Thank you.
Uh, I hope to see you again very soon, and thank you for joining the 301 exclusive talk.
Thank you very much. Reach out anytime if you need anything.
Definitely will. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
great
And
day.
your viewers as well. Thank you.